Now, I know this is a sensitive subject because really when parents go through IVF, it's just because they want a child of their own. Perhaps they've struggled with infertility for years, they've tried everything else they know to do, and this is their final solution. So everything I say today, I say with immense sensitivity. I know that there is a struggle there, the longing inside to become a parent. So when I talk about IVF, it's not in a judgmental way at all. It's simply presenting some facts that we might not have known so that we can then make educated decisions. One of those facts, very quickly, according to Planned Parenthood's own research arm, which is the Guttmacher Institute, nearly 66 million abortions have been performed since Roe v. Wade. Now, according to Guttmacher again, just over 1 million abortions were committed in the U.S. in 2023. Now, according to estimates calculated by Live Action, which is probably the most well-known, largest pro-life organization on the planet, an estimated 1.3 million embryos appear to have died during the IVF process in 2023. That's using conservative estimates from a basic IVF process. In 2023, a little over 1 million abortions were performed, at least the documented ones. And in the same year, we've got 1.3 million embryos being destroyed through the IVF process. What does this all mean? It means that just in the past few years, IVF has now become the biggest taker of life, even surpassing abortion in the United States. Now, we're going to break these numbers down even more in today's episode. Let's get to it. Well, welcome to This Side of the Page podcast. We're talking about issues that really we need to deal with on this side of the page of history, and the church needs a voice on this. And in order to have a voice, though, we need to be educated. So the first thing, even before numbers and before we break down more stuff, we want to know the Father's heart on this. And this is just what God's dropped in my heart. Of course, you feel free to pray about all this stuff. But for me, this is what I felt the Father's heart for this episode is this: for my people to know that those children are my children. And he had me even capitalize the word my. They're my children. So whether a child is conceived in the womb, in a test tube, in a petri dish, it doesn't matter. A human being first and foremost belongs to God. And I want to reiterate again, this is not to condemn anyone who has chosen IVF or is thinking about it. It's just to give some education so that we can be guided by some facts and some principles moving forward. So those numbers that I mentioned earlier, that about 1.3 million embryos have been destroyed in the IVF process just in the year 2023. That was based off conservative estimates of about 9 embryos per retrieval. So how the IVF process works is doctors will use medications to grow or develop multiple eggs, get them mature enough for retrieval. They'll retrieve those eggs from the ovary or ovaries. They inseminate those eggs with sperm. They culture any resulting fertilized eggs, which are now embryos. Sperm and egg have met. And they can do a number of things with these embryos now that they have them. Number one, they'll test those embryos. And by the way, out of the normally 15, and depending on which lab a person goes with, but normally 15 eggs are retrieved. About 13 of those will become usable mature eggs. About 10 of those eggs will become fertilized, and conception occurs at that point. And again, it doesn't matter if it's in a womb or in a petri dish or a test tube. That's a human being now. About 8 of those embryos will develop to day 3 of their lives. So we've already lost 2. About 7 embryos develop to the blastocyst stage, so we've lost 1 more. About 3 embryos will be deemed chromosomally normal after PGT testing. So basically that just means that they've examined all the embryos, they've determined which ones they think are best for the transfer. They'll transfer about 2 embryos, and again, depending on the lab, 2 or 3 maybe, and they'll expect 1, maybe, hopefully, to make it. So when I say transfer, that means that the embryos are used, that were just conceived, or after thawing, they'll be transferred to the womb of the female. And then all of that is hopefully just getting down to 1 live birth. All of those numbers going from 15 eggs to 10 mature eggs being fertilized by sperm all the way down to 1 live birth. That is called a IVF funnel because the numbers are getting slimmer and slimmer as you go down. So you can see just in that one sample IVF funnel from that one clinic that at least 9 lives were lost there, if we're counting embryos as human lives, which we obviously will be. Today's episode, I felt very strongly to go into exactly why, scripturally and scientifically, why embryos should be considered living human beings. And not just living human beings, but also persons. That's an important distinction that some make. They say that living humans are not persons because personhood has to do with dignity, value, and worth, and you deserve to be protected, whereas just being a human, but not a person, you don't have that dignity, value, and worth, and you're not worthy of being protected. The dualism there, where they separate humanity from personhood, I've never seen a case where that needs to happen. Now, if you've ever wondered why the freezing process works, there's some information that I didn't know that I came across, and here it is. First, once those embryos come into being by sperm and egg meeting, the embryologist dehydrates the embryo and replaces its water content. And again, this is just a few cells thick at this point, maybe max 100 cells thick. It replaces all of its water content with concentrated solutions called cryoprotectants, which act like medical antifreeze. So they take away that human's water, replace it with this solution called cryoprotectant, and then they undergo ultra-rapid cooling. So the dehydrated embryo is plunged into liquid nitrogen, and it takes it from room temperature all the way down to negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of seconds. And this rapid drop solidifies the embryo into a safe, glassy state rather than a crystalline one. And that's important. If the water content were to remain, or if the freezing process would be any slower, then all of that water would crystallize and basically burst the embryo, and it wouldn't survive the process. So that's why they have to replace its water content. And then basically it's in suspended animation. So at that temperature, negative 320 degrees Fahrenheit, all cellular activity and the metabolism completely cease, growth and development completely cease physically, and that basically allows the embryo to be preserved for decades without deteriorating at all. According to IVF clinics, there has been shown to be exactly zero difference between one that started to be cryopreserved in liquid nitrogen yesterday versus one that was preserved 30 years ago. There's no difference at all. And then to thaw that embryo, when they're going to be transferred to a mother, whether it's their mother or another one, we'll get to that in a minute. To thaw that embryo, the process is rapidly reversed. So they're warmed quickly in a matter of seconds, and then it says gently rehydrated through a series of solutions to safely draw the cryoprotectants out and allow water back into the cells. So basically returning it back to normal. Now, a lot of the information I'll get today is from SART, S-A-R-T. That is the Society for Assisted Reproductive Technology. Just to let you know how big this organization is, in 2018, about 86% of all IVF clinics in the United States were members of SART, which accounted for more than 95% of IVF cycles. A cycle is when they, take out the eggs, do all that stuff. That would be a cycle. And it is important to note that, like I said before, Live Action got their numbers from estimating about 9 embryos per cycle, resulting in 1 live birth. But fertility businesses often list anywhere from about 7 embryos up to as many as 17 per cycle. So that's why I kept saying it was a conservative estimate with just 9. Now, here's the big point of the episode that I really felt the Lord pushing me towards. Life begins at conception. So these are human lives. Life does not begin at implantation. It definitely doesn't begin at birth. Any textbook would agree. Now, why would we say conception and not implantation? Well, implantation is where the embryo makes a connection to his or her mom about 5 days into their process of growing and developing. But even before that 5 days, they've already been growing and developing. So implantation allows them to continue to grow, but only conception allows them to start to grow. So it really makes no sense to say that life begins at implantation. Yet, that is what the IVF doctors are told in the IVF clinics. Now, it gets really confusing, and even IVF doctors themselves who left the IVF industry have said it was confusing, and they even said that they knew in the back of their minds that it didn't make sense, that they were hearing two different things, because in medical school and just from common sense, life begins at conception, and they knew that didn't mesh. And so this is a really good call to just remember that these doctors, yes, they're very smart, but they are just human beings, and they're susceptible to failure, to gaps in logic, because they're on their own journey of education as well. They're going into this with feelings and emotions just like the parents are. The parents want to be counseled on how they can have a child. Well, the doctors, their hearts are a lot of times in the right place, at least from the ones that I've heard. Live Action has great videos that I'll link in the description if I remember. And they interviewed IVF doctors, IVF kids who were conceived with IVF, and IVF parents who were seeking counsel and guidance on how to do this. So back to what I was saying, the IVF doctors are there because they want to help start families. But kind of like abortionists, they're came a day for these particular IVF doctors that I listened to where they just all of a sudden kind of woke up and they were like, oh my goodness, life begins at conception. Here we are discarding embryos that we don't need. Something doesn't click with that. And so they started to do their own research and they left. So if you have time, that is a really good video for you to check out. But anyways, conception, they start to grow. Implantation, they just continue to grow. Just like any other part of their process. Later on, they'll have a heartbeat. Well, they've been growing and developing. That's just one more stage. And then they'll have more brain activity. Well, that's just one more stage. Then they'll have fully developed lungs before they are born. Well, that's just one more stage. So we can't really pick and choose a stage to give them personhood. And this is one of the huge skips in logic, I would say, of trying to separate personhood from humanity, is that we can't just pick and choose one stage to assign a person personhood, which means they have a right to life and dignity and they should be protected. Because people disagree. Some say that it's a certain point in brain development where they can feel pain. That's when we should assign them personhood. But before that, they're not valuable. Or some people say when they're born and they take their first breath. Well, what does traveling a few inches down the birth canal and having more oxygen in their lungs all of a sudden make them a person? It just logically doesn't make any sense. Some people say, well, when they have a heartbeat, then they're a person. But before then, they're not. Well, that makes no sense either. Are we just going to pick and choose organs? Maybe I want to choose that when their kidneys develop fully, then they're persons. We can start to see how arbitrary that is. All right, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we get into some more science, which I'm very excited to get into because it just lays out some definitions and it says very clearly and succinctly why embryos are humans. And don't tune out at this point. You'll want to hear it because it's just so simple. But before we get to that, let's dive into some scripture. When I did the episode on abortion, which I highly recommend, give it a listen, we went to the same Psalm 139, but we're going to hit it again, along with some other verses, because we can't hear this too often. Verses 13 through 16 of Psalm 139 says this, "For you formed my inward parts." So this is God being intricately involved with human development in the womb. "You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret." So this is not a self-directed thing. I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance. In your book were written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, when as yet there was none of them. I love Jeremiah 1:5 because in Psalm 139, it speaks about when the author of that psalm was in the womb. But Jeremiah 1:5 says, before I formed you in the womb. And this is from God's perspective. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And that knowing in the Hebrew is an intricate knowing. And before you were born, I consecrated you. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. So that's saying that every single human life, even before conception, God already knows intricately, and it's not just another life for him. He has their whole life planned out. Of course, only with good things, and then the enemy and the flesh can step in and introduce some bad things. But God's got his plan for it all, to use even those bad things for good. Not that he caused them, but he can use them for good. Now, here's one that I've not really used before for this, but Focus on the Family, wonderful organization, check them out if you haven't already, uses this to specifically point to conception in Scripture. And it's a little negative tone. It's talking about sin, but it does point to conception. Listen to this, Psalm 51, verses 5 through 6. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. And then it takes a more positive note in verse 6. Yet you desired faithfulness. Even in the womb, you taught me wisdom in that secret place. So we've got a few things going on here. Number one, in the womb, he's being taught wisdom, which is so cool. You know, the womb is our first classroom, our first class womb, you could say. And is there evidence of children learning even in the womb? Absolutely. And some may look at this verse and say, well, how can a child be taught wisdom in the womb? Well, God knows what he's doing. That's up to him. And we can even look at John the Baptist recognizing the presence of Jesus and leaping in the womb of his mother when Jesus drew near to him for the first time. Jesus himself at that time being in the womb. But let's pinpoint the conception piece here in verse 5. Sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Well, that sounds pretty negative, but let's focus in on the positive part. Someone can't be sinful unless they're alive and they're a person, right? And it mentions conception. So I think that's a good scriptural basis there. We'll leave it there. I'm sure there's more. But let's look at some science. Now, when I first read this, it blew my mind that somebody could just lay it out so well. I'll read this. It can get a little bit technical, but I think it's pretty simple if we follow along. I don't blame you if you got to go back and listen to it a couple times. That's okay. I won't tell a soul. So the main point of this is just seeing when does a new cell type form. So this is saying that cells are considered a unique, different cell from all other cells when they meet two criteria. So for these embryos to be considered a new cell, separate from sperm and egg, because when sperm and egg combine, they become something new. So to speak to that newness, we've got to have two criteria to be a new type of cell. Number one, have a different molecular composition from other cells, and number two, behave differently. So molecular composition and behavior. Well, let's look at molecular composition. Based on these criteria, the joining or fusion of sperm and egg clearly produces a new cell type, the zygote, or one-cell embryo. Cell fusion is a well-studied and very rapid event occurring in less than a second. Because, and here's where I want us to tune in, because the zygote arises from the fusion of two different cells, it contains all the components of both sperm and egg, and therefore, this new cell has a unique molecular composition that is distinct from either gamete. So it's not a sperm, it's not an egg, it's both, so it's new. Thus, the zygote that comes into existence at the moment of sperm-egg fusion meets the first scientific criterion for being a new cell type. That is, its molecular makeup is clearly different from that of the cells that gave rise to it, being sperm and egg. Okay, so that's number one. It is very different in its molecular composition because it's neither sperm nor egg, it's both. So it's very different. And then what's the second criterion that we mentioned? It needs to behave differently to be considered a new cell type. Let's look at that. Subsequent to sperm-egg fusion, events rapidly occur in the zygote that do not normally occur in either sperm or egg. Within minutes, the zygote initiates a change in its internal state that will, over the next 30 minutes, block additional sperm from binding to the cell surface. And then it gets into why this is different. Thus, the zygote acts immediately to oppose the function of the gametes from which it is derived. While the goal of both sperm and egg is to find each other and to fuse, the first act of the zygote is to prevent any further binding of sperm to the cell surface. Clearly, the zygote has entered into a new pattern of behavior and therefore meets the second criterion for being a new cell type. I love this type of logic that is just being laid out clearly. In order to be this, it needs to do this and this. Here's how it does the first thing. Here's how it does the second thing. Boom. It meets the definition. Love it. It's pretty irrefutable. The conclusion of the scientist who's writing this, by the way, this is written by Lozier Institute, if you want to look it up. This scientist's conclusion. The conclusion that human life begins at sperm-egg fusion is uncontested, objective, based on the universally accepted scientific method of distinguishing different cell types from each other, and on ample scientific evidence, thousands of independent peer-reviewed publications. Moreover, it's entirely independent of any specific ethical, moral, political, or religious view of human life or of human embryos. So it's just saying no matter what you believe, you can't deny the science here. Indeed, this definition does not directly address the central ethical questions surrounding the embryo, such as what value ought society to place on human life at the earliest stages of development. A neutral examination of the evidence merely establishes the onset of a new human life at a scientifically well-defined moment of conception, a conclusion that unequivocally indicates that human embryos from the one-cell stage forward are indeed living individuals of the human species, that is, human beings. But what can we get from this? Simply, life begins at conception, uncontested. Therefore, embryos made in a lab have just as much intrinsic value as those in the womb, which in turn have the same value as any other human being, even outside the womb. In fact, when we start to think about this, Scott Klusendorf brought this up. He's the SLED guy. You might have heard of him. Wonderful pro-life debater, thinker, author. You should check him out. Maybe I'll link something in the description for him. But he mentioned where there's a viewpoint of where someone doesn't consider a child in the womb to be a person until they have exited the womb. Well, there's a certain doctor who specializes in doing heart procedures for babies in the womb. And for his procedure to work, he literally has to take the entire child out of the womb, perform the heart procedure, and then put him or her back inside the womb. So the argument that this very small human only gains personhood outside the womb begins to fall apart a little bit, because they would have to say, well, inside the womb, they're not a person. Then when they're taken out to perform this surgery, they are a person. And then they become not a person again when they're placed back inside the womb. And then eventually, if they're born, then they become a person again. We can't flip-flop back and forth here. Person's a person. And to quote my favorite Dr. Seuss book, no matter how small. Here's something else to be maybe a bit concerned about, is that just because IVF is an industry and it's a scientific industry does not mean that it's regulated. In fact, it's highly unregulated, according to people who have worked there. And they were the doctors who were actually doing the inseminations and doing the transfers and doing all this stuff. In fact, some people consider it to be the Wild West of IVF. No law, no sheriffs, things just go on that are unreported all the time. In fact, that one doctor, he was saying that by his calculations, there were about 5 million embryos frozen at the moment, when normal reporting only reports about 1 million. So there isn't many people who they actually answered to. There was one mom in those live action videos who was talking about her personal story, and she mentioned that in her case, she had 20 embryos. She had 20 children. And after some time had passed, she had come to the realization, like, these are my kids. They don't belong to anybody else. They're mine. So I need to take responsibility for all 20 of them. And that's what she did. She didn't leave herself any other choice. She went ahead and paid for transfers for all of them. And of course, sometimes that works out, sometimes it doesn't. But to her credit, she took responsibility for every single one, because she realized she didn't have 20 potential children. She had 20 children. Whether they were in her womb, out of their womb, in a freezer vat, it doesn't matter. they were hers. Now, speaking of transfers, what are the possible futures for a child conceived with IVF? And to be frank, this is the part of the equation with IVF that not a lot of people think about. And again, very understandably so. You know, the sorrow, the despair of a couple who wants to be parents. I can see why they are just in that mode of thought where they are just thinking, I want to be a dad, I want to be a mom. But when we switch over to thinking about what about these children, that's what kind of gets us to a step where we look inside the IVF industry and see what's actually going on. So instead of just the parental side, let's look at the possible futures for a child conceived with IVF. They're an embryo. They're there in a vat, and I'll show some pictures on the screen. So if you're just listening, you might want to take a look at this one. Possible futures for a child. They could be transferred to their mother or a mother. And when they're transferred, they could either be transferred and not survive that process, or they could be transferred and develop for a while in the womb and then be miscarried, which IVF babies have a little bit more possibility of birth defects than normally conceived children. So our first two possibilities for the child is be transferred and it work, be transferred and it not work. Our third possibility is be intentionally discarded. And the reasons for that was they would have survived, but they're intentionally discarded after they didn't pass genetic testing. What one IVF doctor said, actually that same doctor that we've been talking about in the live action interview, he said that they would let the new guy experiment. So whatever sort of experiment they're doing, stem cell research, anything like that, if it's an unwanted embryo, one that they are not planning on freezing, then they will use that embryo for research purposes, which means it will eventually be destroyed through whatever process they're doing. And when they're done with their experimentation, then the embryo is simply tossed into the biohazard waste bin. That's just what happens. And that's where a lot of these embryos go. So to be clear, where do we get these massive numbers like 1.3 million loss of life, that conservative estimate? It's not really when embryos are being transferred to a mother and it doesn't work out. That's not where the big loss of life is. Of course, that is loss of life. But the big loss of life is not in the transfer process at all, trying to get to a mom. Big loss of life is just in the lab. Either the embryo doesn't survive the freezing process or the embryo is experimented on and ultimately discarded or destroyed. Or the last possibility is they're just frozen indefinitely. And I used to think that parents might forget that they were there, but actually they're billed either monthly or annually for storage, their storage fees, to keep up with the cost of maintaining the embryo at that temperature. So there's no way they can forget because they're shelling out money for it. Why do people choose IVF? I think the main thing is that they're just thinking for their desire for a child, which I completely get. I do. But that's also paired with a trust that doctors know what's best. And do some doctors know what's best? Absolutely. They're very smart. However, knowledge doesn't always equal wisdom. And especially if those doctors don't see the reality that life begins at conception and they don't count the cost that to get to the one live birth, many, many embryos are lost in the process, then that's where things can get a little fuzzy. Because that's what the end goal is, to get to that live birth. However, to get there, what's the cost? That's what we have to ask ourselves. So while I celebrate the live births, absolutely, that's a wonderful thing that people who couldn't have otherwise been parents get to be. That's wonderful. However, again, at what cost? That's where we have to weigh this in the balance. And when we're weighing human lives in the balance, we've got to draw a line in the sand somewhere. Now, alternatives to IVF. This first alternative may seem extremely simplified, but hear me out. The first one is treating the underlying causes of infertility. Now, the reason that may seem simple, but still worth noting, is because depending on which doctor a couple may go to, well, doctors call it practice for a reason. It's because each doctor may do it a little bit differently. Some doctors may say, oh, you're infertile? Well, IVF is your solution. And they spend zero time, zero effort trying to get to why they're infertile. Whereas other doctors may immediately look into their medical history and why is this person infertile? Is there a history of that, or is it their environmental factors? Is it a certain food they're eating or a disease they have? Can we cure that? Is there something we can do? Many doctors will do many different things, and some of them I assume would fall in the middle of that spectrum somewhere, where they dig, but maybe they didn't dig deep enough. And this is not a dig at doctors. It's just the reality. Some don't care, some do. Some may care, but their only treatment is through medications, and it's not seeing, are there medicinal herbs that would cure that? Are there different natural things we can do to cure that? Is it stress that's causing it? Is your lifestyle, do you not have enough margin in your life at all? Are you taking Sabbaths? Is that causing your cortisol levels to rise and kick off all your other hormones out of whack? So there are many things a person can do. Their diet, many other things with lifestyle. So that may be the first thing to look at. And yes, consult your doctor, absolutely. But also, I implore you, consult the great physician about that as well. Pray. Get people around you who you know can hear God's voice, and really give that focused effort. I'm not saying don't consult medical professionals, but consult the medical professional as well and see what he has to say. Another alternative to IVF is to consider that, yes, we want our own biological child, but we can also foster to adopt. We can go the traditional adoption route. I don't know if you know this, but there are around, depends on how you estimate this, but there are around 344,000 children in foster care at the moment, waiting to be adopted. Guess how many churches there are, Christian churches, in the United States? Just a little bit more than that. So I used to think, man, if every family would just adopt a child, then it wouldn't be a problem anymore. But really, it's not just every family. It's just one family from every Christian church in the nation. If one family from each church would adopt a child, there'd be no more children waiting to be adopted. So we could do our part in that. That reminds me of the verse, if my people would pray, humble themselves, seek my face. He doesn't say everybody. He doesn't say the world. My people. So adoption might be the answer for you. Again, pray about it. Now, if you're like, but Adam, I would love to adopt, but I would also love to carry a child, give birth to my child, breastfeed my child, all of that stuff. Well, there is also something, little known fact, called snowflake adoption. Snowflake adoption is where a couple or an individual would basically apply to adopt one of these frozen embryos, one of those children. I'll try to remember to link in the description a website called Nightlight that facilitates Christian adoption, including snowflake adoption. And it's from a conversation with Nightlight that I actually learned this information about the 1 million frozen embryos who are waiting to be transferred. Here's the cool thing about snowflake adoption. I'll put a little plug in for them. They informed me that because legally embryos at the moment are not seen as persons, but just objects, it's actually easier and a lot cheaper to do snowflake adoption than traditional adoption. Now, just because I said it's easier doesn't mean we shouldn't pray about it, but that is good to know. The thing I hope the most from this episode is that you heard my heart, but even more than that, that you heard the Father's heart on just the fact that all these embryos are children and they're His children, and He has a plan and a destiny for them. Even if they're frozen for who knows how much longer, He still has them in His heart, and He wants good things for all of them. Let me pray for you real quick. Father, I thank you in the name of Jesus. I thank you for every single listener, no matter where they are. God, if they're ones just curious about IVF, or if they know a lot about it, or even if they've undergone IVF, God, I thank you for them, and I thank you for your good plans for them. Lord, lead them, guide them. You're the only one who knows exactly what they should be doing to take the next step forward, God, in the right direction. We thank you. We depend on your wisdom. And God, I pray that everybody under the sound of my voice would just submit and yield their hearts to you and exactly what you want for them, Lord. Make it clear the next steps they should take. We thank you for your good plans and that you're powerful enough to bring them about. God, I'm reminded again that each and every plan of the enemy that was meant for harm, God, you intend for good. So God, I ask that you bring about that good in Jesus' name. And we all agree and we say amen. Hey, I love you guys. Subscribe to the podcast if you want to hear more. That helps out more than you know. Share it with somebody who you might think needs it or who might find it interesting. Hope you all have a wonderful day. Be blessed. We'll see you next time. Bye.